Welcome. In this demonstration, we will essentially learn how to draw a distant mountain. So what happens is, as you've seen in other demonstration, in your landscape, you usually need to provide some kind of backdrop to your scene. Essentially you have your tree trunks in the front or some kind of other elements in front, and then as the eyes travel, you need to have some kind of backdrop, that where the eyes can rest. And in other demonstration, we have seen that you can use these kind of parallel lines to create a distant tree line, or you can have this kind of angular parallel lines to kind of have a distant foliage, or you can even create a distant foliage using these kind of shapes. So essentially, these are different ways in which you can have a kind of distant uh, element where the eyes can rest. And one of the great thing that you can do in your landscape is to have and use a mountain as a distant place where the eyes can rest. So that's what we will do. So we will see how we can draw a simple mountain in at a distance and use it effectively in having a nice kind of thing in your landscape that the eyes can rest at. So let's just have a very simple landscape in this demonstration. So what I will do is I'll start by just having one tree trunk over here and the other tree trunk a bit closer to the viewer over here. And what I will do essentially is to then draw a kind of a mountain backdrop over here to see how we can use the mountains as our kind of main element far out in the distance. So let's start by texturing the tree trunks over here. And as we have seen in other demonstrations, the easiest way to texture a tree trunk is to use these angular lines like this, or you can use a kind of wiggly lines, vertical and horizontal intersecting wiggly lines. So what I will do is I will simply use these kind of intersecting lines over here to kind of give a bark texture to my trunk. Like this over here. So just by using these lines, we can quickly put down the bark texture. And also I've darkened one end of the trunk darker than the other. So again, I've seen in other tutorials, to bring out the roundness, you darken one end of the trunk more than the other. So I've left it kind of white over here, and then I will also add some kind of a bit of roughness to the edge. So that also helps to kind of bring out the feel of the trunk and the roughness of the bark. So I'll just quickly add this kind of jaggedness. So there we have it. Very quickly we put together a trunk and its bark texture. And what I will do for this trunk is to use these kind of wiggly lines just to have different feel in our drawing, right? So I like to use different strokes to have different kind of feel in my drawing. So I'll use these kind of wiggly lines over here to create the kind of bark texture for this trunk. And again, just simply use these kind of wiggly lines like this. Don't try to make it parallel, but some kind of wiggle. So what happens is that these wiggles, they indicate some kind of bark essentially, right? So at a distance, these kind of wiggles are kind of indication of some kind of bark in that trunk. And again, what I will do is I will add more of these wiggles to one end. So I've seen in other demonstrations, just simply add the same stroke but more of it to one end to kind of darken it and start to bring out the roundness of the trunk. So there, I will again darken it. As you can see, this is still a bit flat because there is not enough of variation. But as I start to add a bit more darkness over here, as we have a variation of tone from light to dark, then the trunk starts to get an appearance of roundness. And that's what I've done. So here, just by adding a bit more darkness, so now you can see this is darker, this is lighter, and that's giving a nice appearance of roundness. And also these wiggly lines are giving an indication of bark for the trunk. And I will again go ahead and add a bit of jaggedness to the edges to again make it more interesting. And then I'll do the same for the other edges as well. So again, these small things, they kind of bring out more interest in the trunk. So there we have it, right? So these two trunks are now done. And what we will now do is to essentially create a mountain in the distance, and that will be the kind of thing that the eyes of the viewer will travel and rest at. So essentially, to create the mountain in a distance, we first create its outline like this. So this is something that that is up to you. You can choose any different kind of outline, but something like this overlapping outline is a nice generic outline for the mountain. So that's what we do as the first step. And in the next step, to essentially what we want to now do is to shade it in some manner, to give it some kind of a feel, right now. So those in some cases you can just end over here, you can just simply have the outline and be done with it. But if you want to give it a bit more interest in your drawing, what you can do is you can start to kind of give a bit more indication of the texture of the mountain. So what we do is we start by first having these angular parallel lines on the mountain. So what these angular parallel lines do is to give an initial indication of solidity of the mountain. So simply use these parallel lines, these are angular parallel lines. So this is the same line that we actually use for the distant foliage, if you have seen in other tutorials. So these are the same lines, but as I've said before, we use the same stroke in different contexts in pen and ink drawings, right? So these parallel lines are very common and they're used in many different ways, and over here we will use them to essentially give some kind of indication of solidity to the mountains, so give some kind of texture to the mountains. So here once we add the initial layer, we can already see that now our mountains have acquired a bit more form, so right, compared to the just the bare outline. Adding these lines, they give a bit of solidity and some kind of form to the mountain, but they still look kind of flat. That's again because we have a uniform tone for these lines. So what we will do next is to essentially add a bit more of these lines, overlapping lines, to create some kind of darker spots in the mountains, to give it a bit more more feel for roughness, more texture for the mountain. And the way we do it is to essentially kind of if this is your first layer, then try to add it in this kind of layer, this kind of shape. So essentially something like this shape. This shape kind of is what we should aim at. We don't try to have a kind of dark a square spot, because that is not how things will be in perspective. So in a distant mountain, if you have some kind of cut in the on the surface of the mountain, it will be in the shape of this. So essentially you end at a point, you do it like this, and then you end at a point again. So this is the generic shape that we should use to kind of add a bit of darkness to our mountains. So that's what I will do. So essentially, just to show you, so for example, if this is the initial shading, then I will start from here, do a small, then I will increase the size of my lines and then decrease it again. So essentially start, add a bit bigger lines, and then go small. So this is how you will get this kind of shape that will kind of show a bit of roughness on the distant mountains. So that's what I will do now. So I will start here small, add bit, stop. So what I'm doing is just adding a bit of lines like, so essentially I'm adding a bit of this kind of shape and bit of that kind of darkness to my distant mountain. And you can use different sizes. So here I have a bigger, but so essentially what you can see is that at the end the bottom shape of this distant darkness is always something like this. So this kind of indicates a bit of roughness on the surface of the mountain, and you can add a bit more of this as you like. So there just by having those parallel lines as the initial texture, and then by adding a bit more of these kind of darkness using additional parallel lines, we can kind of start to give a bit of feel for the roughness of the texture of the mountains as such. And what we will also do is to add a bit of darkness to the edges. So sometimes you can just the other thing we also do is to kind of do the overlap edges like this, right? So and then add a bit of darkness over there. So just adding a bit of darkness to the edges, give them a feel of kind of solidity and something like this, right? And then I will add a bit more over here. So there so we darken the edges, and what we will also do is to add a bit more dark, solid dark. So essentially these indicate some kind of surface crevices, but you can also then make it more interesting by adding a bit more something like a bit more darker thing. So always try to use a different variation of tones here. So what I'm doing is now adding a bit more dark, and this is lighter dark, this I can add a bit more darker dark here like this. So essentially this is darker, and then you have some other places a bit lighter like this. So we are using a combination of this and even lighter. So in some places you can simply leave the original parallel lines. So essentially what will happen in the end is your mountain will acquire this kind of different spots and this will start to give a feel for kind of the rough texture for the mountain. So essentially in this demonstration, the mountain that we are drawing is kind of a generic mountain with a different kind of roughness to its surface. And the way we are doing this roughness is essentially by adding these lines. So again, just to recap, what we do is to first we lay down an initial layer of these parallel lines for the mountains, and then we add more of parallel lines in this shape to essentially indicate some kind of crevices or other kind of surface irregularities, to give it more depth, to make our mountain more interesting, because essentially the mountains, they have those different planes, those crevices that essentially give them that interest and define them. So there we have it. So essentially this is how you can create a simple mountain in the distance, and this can again be a major element of your composition. So you just create some tree trunks in the front, and then this is what the viewer's eyes will travel to. So there we have it, right? So this is how simply you can create a simple mountain in the distance. Essentially just draw the outline. Just to recap over here, draw the outline, then start by laying down one layer using these parallel lines. So this gives an initial texture to the mountain, and then what you need to do is to add some kind of dark crevices to indicate roughness to the surface of the mountain. And you do this by adding more parallel lines and try to use the shapes like these. So do not use a square shape, because that is not how it will be in perspective, but it will be something like it will start and end at a point. So that's what we start here, make it bigger and end. So something like this. So you just add these spots at different places, and that starts to give your mountain a feel for rough surface like this. And as you add more, it will start to acquire that feel of roughness. And then again, you can add a little bit here, a bit there, and there we have it, right? So this is a simple mountain we drew that has a feel for a rough texture on its on the surface. And what we can do, so I left this white spot because it's always good to kind of have something at the bottom of the mountain to give the transition point. And the easiest to use is these parallel lines as an indication of distant tree line. So that I think that the combination works most effectively. So what I will do is to use these parallel lines over here as an indication of a distant tree line behind which we have our mountain. And again, if you want, you can add a distant foliage, or any other element that we have seen in other drawings. But this simple parallel lines indicating a distant tree line behind which you have the mountain, it works very well. So there we have it, right? So just by using these parallel lines, we indicate a distant tree line, and then behind which we drew our mountain. So always start by having the mountain and then have these parallel lines, because these parallel lines will essentially kind of this tree line you're trying to give hide that base of the mountain, because essentially from a distance you want to have some a nice transition for the viewer. So they look at these lines, these are interpreted as a distant tree line, and then behind which you have the mountains. So there we have it, right? So this is how easily you can actually have a distant mountain. Again, start by laying down the outline, add these parallel lines, and then add a bit of darkness in this shape, kind of this kind of shape, and just add in a bit of random one here, one there. And if you want, you can also darken the edges to give it a bit more solidity, something like this, and soon you will have a mountain that has a nice feel to it. And there we have it, right? So, and I can also darken the base of this distant tree line a bit, just to give it more depth. So I darken this, and finally what we will do is to define a kind of ground cover. And we have seen this in other tutorials. The easiest way to do is to draw these lines that indicate the ground plane. So this is the ground form. So essentially you always have to kind of have some line that indicates the ground form, and then on these lines then we can draw our foliage. I'm sorry, not the foliage, the ground cover that will essentially define our ground. And the easiest foliage to use that we have seen is this kind of grassy stroke. So that's what I will do. So I'll start by using this kind of quick grassy stroke over here. So again, just kind of small lines, small angular lines, and you just start to add a bit more here, a bit there, and soon you will start to have a feel of the ground as grass covered. So I'm not doing any other element in this drawing, but yeah, if you want, you can add more tree trunks, or you can have some other kind of things like stones, or a small even cabin or what have you, right? So you can add any other element, but yeah, my focus was to show you how quickly you can have a mountain in the distance drawn and add it to your landscape to give it a nice pleasing feel. So essentially, what happens is that when you draw a landscape, that's going out in the distance, the viewers, they travel the landscape. So they start by looking at these, tree trunks in the front, and then they go out, and then, so it's always good to have something in the backdrop, where the eyes of the viewers rest. So, we have used distant tree line in some other compositions, but what you can also do is to, have a nice mountain backdrop, which makes the drawing more interesting, and it's a nice, place where the viewers, they can rest as they take in your drawing. And there, I just quickly added some of this grass strokes. So also I like to always, add a bit of this kind of ground cover. So as you can see, if we just leave the ground like this, it's just looking bare. There's no indication of any ground cover. But just by adding few of these lines, you can see that how it acquires a feel of, some ground cover, some kind of grass, right? And that just makes it much more polished. It just makes it much more, much more interesting, and makes it more finished. So I always like to add in a bit of ground cover, just to have a minimal feel for it. You can always add more. So you can always add more wildflowers or other kind of tall grasses that we have seen in the demonstration. So you can always add those other elements as well. But yeah, always try to add some kind of ground cover to give it a feel of a finished drawing. And again, so it's to simply use this stroke. And what you also do is to also vary the size of the grass with distance. I explained this in other tutorials, but what happens is that with distance, every element becomes smaller. The same holds true for the ground cover, and we want to reinforce this with our grass and that ground cover. So what I'm doing is, I'm drawing a very small grass at a distance over here like this, barely anything like this. But as I get closer to the viewer, I increase the size. So as you can see, that the change in the size of the grass is reinforcing the notion of distance in our drawing. So there we have it. I just quickly added a bit of grass. And one more thing that we will do is to ground our trunks. So it's always, so right now the trunks, they just look a bit out of place, in a sense that, there's no indication of, that the grounding of trunks, and that doesn't look nice. So to ground the trunk, what we do is you have to create some kind of darkness around here at the point of, of intersection of the ground and the trunk. And we use this kind of, again, very small grass stroke to create some kind of foliage. We have seen that we can use, if you want some kind of wildflower or anything, but essentially you need to provide some kind of foliage at the base of the trunk to ground it. And what we do is we simply use this kind of small grass stroke, dense grass stroke like this. And when you use this stroke and you add a bit more of it, you create a bit of darkness, kind of a bit higher density, and this kind of darkness serves to ground the trunk. So here, just by adding a bit of this kind of darkness, we are able to ground the trunk, and this looks much nicer than this, right? So here you can again see that this is ungrounded, and just by adding a bit of this kind of grass stroke, I will again ground this trunk, and this trunk will again look much polished, and the overall drawing will have a much nicer impact than trunks that are not grounded. So again, simple small things that you can do to kind of bring a finished element to your drawing. So there, just by adding a few of this stroke, this trunk looks grounded as well. And what we can do, if you want, you can always add, like I said, a bit of wildflowers, something like this, right? So let's add a bit of wildflowers, and the way you do it, again, draw a stem like this, and draw a flower like this, and then add a wiggle at the base to ground that stem. So let's draw something like this. So I'll just add some wildflowers over here, and again, you have to keep the size in perspective, right? So the size of the trunk and the flowers, they should kind of match, right? So I cannot draw a big flower over here. So I will have the sizes in perspective. So essentially, when the viewers, they look at the scene, they look at different elements, and for the whole composition to make sense, you have to have two things. One, the things should follow the rules of perspective. So any trunk that is further out should be much smaller than the one that is closer to the viewer. And secondly, if you have, like, for example, a stone, then the size of the stone and the trunk, for example, should be in proportion that the viewer is expecting, so that then they can make sense of your scene. So here, just by adding few of this, something like this, so I just keep adding more and more. I'm adding a patch of wildflowers on for my ground. And the other thing is that I'm adding it in an organic shape. I'm not adding it in a line like this, right? So always try to use an organic shape in your drawing, right? So when you add a bunch of flowers, or even when you lay down your trees, don't lay them down in a line or in a pattern. Just have one here, one there. So that kind of organic layout always makes the drawing more believable, because in landscape, that's how things are, right? So again, I add a bit more grass just to finish it, and then I have to ground these trunks, these stems. So I just add a bit of wiggle. So just add a bit of wiggle to this flower stems to ground them. And if you want, what you can also do is to kind of darken the base of the flowers to bring a bit of attention to them. So essentially, in your drawing, you have lighter spots and darker spots, and the way the eyes they consume the drawing is by moving from darker spots to the lighter, and something like that, right? So if you want to have some attention for the flowers, what you can do is you can add a bit more grass over here at the base of this flower. So what will happen is that as I will start to add the grass, I'm adding a bit more kind of darkness to this area, and that will essentially again become a focal point. So the darker areas in your drawing, they tend to be the focal point, and that's something that attracts the viewer. And if they're surrounded by white areas, then they actually become even more of a focal point. So over here, we have the mountain is darker, and this distant tree line is darker, so together this is a focal point. But here then we have a bit of white over here from the ground. And then if we add a bit more grass over here, so I add some more grass at the base of the wildflowers, then what will happen is that the viewer's eyes, they will be attracted to this area, because this is kind of a darker area surrounded by lighter, so that becomes a focal point. And that's what I'm doing, right? So it's always nice to have different focal points in your drawing, that the viewers can travel from one to the other. So that's what I do over here. A bit of so there, just by adding a bit of grass at the bottom, we have a nice patch of wildflowers in our composition. So there we have it. So I just wanted to show you how quickly you can draw your mountains. Just draw the outline. Just to recap, draw the outline, draw these kind of parallel angular lines just to have an initial texture for the mountain. And then what you do is you use this kind of shape, right? This kind of shape that starts and ends in a point, but then is bigger, so something like that. So this kind of shape is what you can use to kind of provide a bit more of roughness to your mountain. So that's what you can just add a bit here, a bit there, just try to add some kind of different tones. But again, do not use a kind of flat square or rectangle shape, because that is not how things are in perspective. So you always have to kind of use this kind of perspective view. And what I did is to just add one here, few here, few there, and then soon you have a feel of the mountain as kind of having a rough texture, something like this right here. So again, you can see that as I'm adding those kind of dark spots over here, now my mountain is starting to get a feel of some kind of rough texture. And again, how rough you want it all depends on, if you add more, you'll have a bit more roughness, on the other hand, if you use less, then your mountain will have more of a uniform tone. And then also you can also darken just the outline, because that also adds to the kind of roughness and weight of the mountain. So we can do that as well over here. And there we have it, a quick landscape, we drew in under 20 minutes that you can enjoy doing anytime. Thanks, take care, bye-bye.